Well, and let's finish off this week by looking at BER case 08-10. I'm tempted to say the infamous 08-10. Um, this is a case that has stirred up. I mean, if there's controversy in engineering ethics, it's a small world, but this case is it. I mean, I think that a lot of people were disturbed by this case, or disturbed by the conclusion that the BER came to in this case, which is an interesting conclusion. I'm not condemning it. I'm not saying it was wrong, but it's surprising. I don't know. First, we read the facts, right? And read the facts, right, about an engineer who is concerned about a piece of medical equipment that may not only present a hazard to the public, but in this case, the public being human infants, makes it perhaps more dramatic. The concern about the misplacement of a relief valve on a respirator that could present a hazard to infants during surgery. You read that, where an engineer expresses a concern, assumes that something will be done, and then finds out that nothing was done, yet at least, and that the product that he's concerned about is now in use, by the public. And, what is it? Engineer A again urges the manager to take immediate action. When the manager indicates that the matter is still being looked into by a design team, engineer A indicates that if prompt measures are not taken to correct the problem, he will be compelled. And that, being compelled means you recognize you have a duty, right? If you're compelled morally, that means that you have no choice in your mind. That is, you have an ethical duty, you have an ethical obligation to do something. That he will be compelled to report the matter to an appropriate federal regulatory agency. And maybe the first surprising thing or the first notable thing is, what is the question? Right? What is the question that the BER, looking at this set of facts, what is the prominent ethical engineering question, or the engineering ethics question for them? And it is, was it ethical for engineer A to indicate that if prompt measures are not taken to correct the problem, he will be compelled to report the matter to an appropriate federal regulatory agency? That is, for them, the issue here, the ethical issue here, is not the company, what they did. And in a way, that's correct, right? Because, engineering ethics is about engineers and what they do. It's not about what companies do, right? Companies are not engineers. So I think that there's nothing wrong with that in a way, right? It may be a little like, well, wait a second, why are we focusing on the, well, it's engineering ethics. So the question really is not whether the company acted ethically, whether the public should be. The question is, was it ethical for the engineer to make this ultimatum to their employer? And surprise, surprise, the conclusion is that it was not ethical. In fact, they characterize what the engineer did as basically making a threat, which I think that language is at the very least questionable. But their conclusion is, was not ethical for engineer A to indicate that, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, that's quite interesting, right? Because it certainly does seem that engineer A is set up here to be the hero. Notices something which, at least in his professional judgment, it constitutes a threat, and now an imminent threat, right? Because the thing is being released to the public, and makes an ultimatum. Says, either you're going to do something about this now, or I will be compelled. That is, I have a duty to report the matter to the government. And the discussion is incredibly interesting, right? There's a reference here to 76-4, which we read last week. And by contrast, right? Because in 76-4, the engineer had a duty to blow the whistle. Here, the engineer is being taken to task ethically for threatening or saying that he will blow the whistle. There are differences in the details of the case, no doubt. And one of the ones that they point out is that in 76-4, the engineer was directly involved in the project. In this case, the engineer was merely asked by another engineer to evaluate this device, but was not involved in the design of the device, etc. Now, whether that means that he was not directly involved, I think that that's a matter of semantics. I'm not really sure, but that's a big point in this case. The idea that the engineer does not have all the facts. The end of the discussion is instructive, right? We're starting right here. This conclusion does not diminish in any way Engineer A's concern regarding his obligation to hold paramount public safety, of course. As the facts indicate, Engineer A has properly raised the public safety issue. That is, has informed management. This is what he should do. This is what he has a duty to do. Listen, there's a problem with this device. And it appears that MedTech was in the process of investigating the matter and determining whether a basis exists for those concerned. That investigation was presumably being conducted by individuals competent in the design and manufacturing of the respirator device in question. I suppose, I don't know. That's interesting, right? The Board of Ethical Review seems to be saying that the engineers should assume that his company is acting responsibly and competently. Maybe, but there's no evidence that they are, right? The only evidence that the engineer has at that point is his own judgment that the thing is a hazard. So really, I think that's maybe the first questionable point. I'm not saying it's wrong, but the first questionable point: how much faith are you supposed to have in your company? And then the discussion ends this way: if after making additional inquiries, Engineer A determines that no meaningful actions are being taken to address the issue, Engineer A should explore internal mechanisms within MedTech to seek further recourse regarding this issue. Only if such efforts do not produce satisfactory results should Engineer A consider exploring external avenues for action. Okay. Well, that is a recurring theme in BER cases having to do with whistleblowing, having to do with first canon issues. We'll read a very famous essay written by DeGeorge later that lays out certain criteria for whistleblowing. And, I find it's been very influential, this essay by DeGeorge on whistleblowing. And I have no idea why, because it's just some guy saying some stuff. I'm not saying it's bad, but, I'm not saying it's exactly good either. But in any case, this is a continuing theme in the BER, being very, very careful about saying not only when it's obligatory for an engineer to blow the whistle, when it's even permissible for the engineer to blow the whistle. In this case, the idea is that you should exhaust internal mechanisms before you do it. That is, that as an engineer working for a company, especially as an employed engineer, you have the obligation to exhaust all internal channels in an attempt to correct the problem before you go outside the company. That means, again, in the words of DeGeorge, not just your immediate supervisor, not just your immediate supervisor's immediate supervisor, going as far as to the board of directors. Actually, it's not so hard to find the board of directors, at least find their emails. I've done it. You can do that. But a very interesting, the restraint here, saying that unless you do that, you're being unethical. And even to give your employer an ultimatum that you will do it under certain circumstances is unethical. Very interesting.